Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully, everybody had a good lunch. And I know we're standing between you and probably a long week which you had this week at reInvent. And some of you probably have a flight to catch. Some of you probably want to unwind and enjoy a little bit more of Vegas hospitality as well. So what we decided to do is we decided to keep it a little simple, a little lighter. So first of all, let's start with an introduction. So I'm Pankaj Kaul. I'm part of Insights and Data Practice for Capgemini. I lead our business and analytics teams for telecommunication, media entertainment, and technology sectors. And with me, I have...
My name is Michael Emery with Cox Communications, and I run what we refer to as our DSS team. That's Data Support Systems, but it's part of the technology organization at Cox.
So what we thought of is, since we're going to be talking to a lot of data folks, people who are either involved with data and analytics or at least involved with an ecosystem around data and analytics. So we thought of picking up a topic which is potentially going to be relevant to you in the context of how we see data and analytics ecosystems evolving. And obviously, we're going to talk about an organization who is utilizing and thank you, who is utilizing data and analytics to drive new frontiers. We all know the relevance of data and analytics in the context of business operations today. There's enough research available which suggests that about 22% of the organizations are going after using data and analytics to drive extensive growth in their top line. There are organizations who can improve 70% revenue per FTE if they tap into the data ecosystem appropriately. That being said, only 1 in 6 organizations actually has been able to master the data today, which means there's a lot of work for all of us in this room to do. With that being said, the way we structure this conversation is we're going to obviously talk about how the data frontiers are evolving and how they're getting utilized, the relevance of those frontiers with respect to achieving business goals, because if the data strategy is not tied to your business goals, it's not really a strategy. And then we'll talk about the live experience of how all of this is coming to life. With that said, Mike, since you are representing Cox as it's a very large enterprise, it does a lot of different businesses. For the sake of this audience, we're going to talk about one of those entities. Do you mind taking a little time and walking us through the Cox ecosystem and some of the business strategy, business goals, which you guys are trying to achieve through data?
Absolutely. Is this working now? Okay. I'll reintroduce myself. I think my mic wasn't working. Michael Emery with Cox Communications, and I run what we refer to as the DSS practice. It's a part of technology. It's data and support systems. So just show of hands, who here has heard of Cox family of businesses? Looks like most of you guys. So this slide says the Cox family of businesses, but it'd really be more appropriate, in the way we think of it, is Cox is a family business. Right? It was founded in the late 1800s by James Cox, and it is still run by the Cox family. Our current CEO is his great-grandson, Alex Taylor, and the company operates that way. It's a private company. Looking up through the list of brands you'll see on here, I work for Cox Communications. That's that first one, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, so I'll skip that for right now. Cox Automotive is our sister division or sister brand. If anyone has purchased a car anytime recently, Cox Automotive was almost guaranteed to be part of that transaction, right? They run most of the auctions in the country. A lot of the software that is used by dealers is a part of Cox Automotive. So whether you bought it from a dealer or bought it as a private transaction, Autotrader.com, Kelley Blue Book are some of the brands that we have out on the market as well. And then the third division on here is Cox Enterprises, which is the corporate umbrella, but really some of the new growth areas we're looking at as a company. They own some of the media assets that we still have as part of going back to our legacy of James Cox, who founded the company with a newspaper. Also a lot of work in the sustainability space and actually moving into farming. We probably didn't know that Cox is the largest operator of greenhouses in North America. So those are some of the areas that we're focusing on. But I'm part of the Cox Communications group, and that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. So Cox is if you go back in time to 20, 30 years, we are the cable company, right? That's where our roots came in for Cox Communications. You guys can see some of the bullets on how we've evolved over time. We're right now the largest private telco in the United States. Over almost 7 million residential customers serviced across the country. And probably the bullet on here most interesting and most proud of is you can see 260,000 miles of our network. Right, and so we are in markets across the country. Las Vegas, where you guys are now, is one of our biggest markets. If you've been to the stadium, we provide broadband services for the stadium. Almost all the hotels that you guys have stayed in, we are the primary provider for that. And then, of course, the residential customers throughout the rest of Las Vegas. But what's interesting is how we've kind of evolved over time and how we're still evolving as a telco company, right? We have moved from traditional video company years ago to offering broadband services, or we call them data services sometimes still, voice services, and now we're moving and evolving again, right? The way people are watching TV, the way people are absorbing content is different. Less and less traditional video subscribers. You know, you hear cutting the cord. Cutting the cord doesn't literally mean cutting the cord in most cases. It means switching over to broadband services, which we provide as well. So plenty of opportunity for that. But over time, we're switching and we're moving into the mobile business as well. Some of the brands you'll see on here is a lot of us is Cox Business, which is our B2B market, is part of what we focus on, and a lot of fiber and network companies are a part of that as well. I do want to give one call out. You'll see up on the top, RapidScale. That's a Cox brand that is a cloud provider. They're one of the sponsors of the session here, so hopefully some of you had a chance to see them over in the expo, or I guess you're probably out of time now to make it up there, but they do have a booth there, and I want to give a call out to them before I move on.
And you're also now, while you talked about mobile, you're also slowly getting into the media side of it, a little bit of content creation, a little bit of media distribution as well. I know it's just picking up, but you're venturing into that area as well.
A little bit. So our primary goal is to really connect customers, is the way we phrase it. So there is some content that's part of that in some companies like RapidScale and some of the network, but we're more focused on the network, less on the content directly. So I will confess, the business goals on the left is not my favorite part of this presentation, and here's why, right? These are our 5 business goals we put on here. To be honest, these 5 goals would apply to any company in the world, right? We want to increase our revenue. We want to reduce our operating costs. We want to find a way to meet customers where they are in the world that we live in now. We want to increase the customer satisfaction, and we want to keep our employees engaged. So while those are our goals, and we work towards them, any company that you guys work for or work with are going to have a fairly similar set of goals. Yep. What's interesting, though, I think, is some of the challenges. As I mentioned, as a telco company, what are some of the intricacies of the world we live in and the changing market as a telco that is applicable here? And that's down here. We have a largely subscriber-based model. So most of our companies most of our customers, whether business or residential, are with us for a long time. So the customer acquisition cost is something we track extremely closely. Network reliability, I mentioned 260,000 miles of network. That network is connected by a lot of devices all throughout the country and all throughout our markets, and that's increasingly important to us. More and more companies, more and more people count on us to have their network up and running. And we've seen that during the pandemic. People counted on having the network to their house running. Yeah. That could not go down the way it might have been able to go down a few years ago. And so that is more and more of our focus, and a lot of our data and a lot of the data strategy, the data transformation we're on is helping to meet that goal as well. And obviously other things about customer preferences. I mentioned, the way people watch content, the way they watch TV, the way they get data to their house, whether through wireless or through wires, is changing, and we need to be on top of that in the way we handle data.
Well, telco is the backbone of anything which happens today, and the more digitization happens, it goes through telco. So if there is an industry which really defines the velocity and the volume of data, it's telecommunications. So I think this is a good introduction, Mike. So I think the next phase, what we're going to do is the challenges which Mike talked about, and then when you marry it or superimpose it with the challenges of the velocity and the volume of data, how do you build a collaboratory data ecosystem which is not designed for today or tomorrow, but which is designed for 2030 and beyond, right? And all of you guys, you have technology background, you know it's easier said than done, because not just from the magnitude of work which is to be done, the technology innovation is happening much faster, much rapidly now than it has ever happened in the history. So how do you really build something for 2030 while you're still trying to have the agility, while you're still trying to have the speed to market, which is required by rapidly evolving business? A cable company getting into mobile, venturing into media, and who knows, maybe a few more, which is behind closed doors getting discussed right now. I'm sure about it. So when we look at data ecosystems and the way the frontiers of those data ecosystems are changing, what you see on the left-hand side is what one of those 6 companies which I said is successful in mastering data has been primarily focused on. None of this is going to come as a surprise to you. Obviously, we want observability. We like interoperability. I know easier said than done, but a lot of clients are working on that. And obviously, it has to be secure. It has to be fast, agile, all that stuff, fancy stuff. But what is challenging this right now is, while all of this is critical, a new dimension which is evolving in the data landscape is how do we create and establish connectivity across the data? Your first-party data, your third-party data, your enterprise data. How do you bring all of that together? Now, by together, I don't mean how do you centralize it and create a massive mothership. Some of that is still required, but you possibly cannot bring the entire data of the world together and load it in one database. You cannot, you should not, right? So how do you create that connectivity? That's one aspect. Second aspect, which is becoming very critical, is in the fast evolving digital world, raw data is not going to be as significant as it has been in the past. The data ecosystems are not just supposed to be modern, which a lot of industry focused on over the last 5-6 years, right? We moved from on-prem to cloud. All of us are in AWS reInvent. We know how cloud has revolutionized everything else. But it's no longer just the modern data ecosystems which are required. You got to build it a smart data ecosystem. Now, what does that mean? I have raw data. Raw data could as simply mean what's the temperature outside, right? The data itself is not relevant. You have to contextualize and process that data to generate some level of information. Information then further needs to be contextualized to generate what we call as knowledge. And knowledge, when applied in context of certain things, in a very ethical and a robust way, drives wisdom. What is expected from these data ecosystems is they enable the wisdom so that the decisions can be made in a rapid fashion at the speed of business. Now, not every decision which is made through data is going to have a multi-billion-dollar impact. It's the decisions which, for example, in the context of cable companies or telecommunication or any utilities companies, is what a field operator has to make on a day-to-day basis. It's a decision which somebody in marketing has to make when you have NFL going on and you have a 30 seconds of an advertising slot, which advertisement to push based on how many eyeballs contract they have with that company. These are split-second decisions to be made on astronomical size of data. It cannot be done based on, let me create a static report and let me give it to an analyst, and then analysts will do their magic, and then they will come back, they will give a feedback to someone, and then somebody will take a decision. 30 seconds are gone. That's the amount of speed which is required today. So when we call something as a smart data platform, it is a platform which is taking raw data, going through its process, and enabling wisdom to be spit out. How do we actually do it? I mean, within Capgemini, we've got about 16, 18 points of, call it a checklist, which we want to enable. But if I have to take the top 8 of that, the very first one is you got to left shift data quality. You cannot generate wisdom on a crappy data. crappy raw data. Now, what do we mean by shifting left on data quality? And most of us who have been on the traditional data warehousing, data lake, data ecosystem kind of environments, we know data quality is an afterthought. We start looking at data quality only after it has landed in a warehouse, in a data lake, or a swamp, or it has landed in an analytical model, or wherever. That's when we realize, oh, this data is bad, let's go and fix it. You cannot generate wisdom at the speed of business operations like that. So data quality needs to shift back. That means you will have to make agentic data pipelines which will actually, using observability, look at the anomalies in the data. Your ML algorithms will fix that data within the data pipeline as the data is flowing through. And an active governance role, which goes to the data contracts, which is on the 5th point over there, make sure that everybody has the right level of information about it. What has changed, why it has changed, why it has been overwritten, why is it relevant, right? So data quality, left shift. Interoperability has to be key. When you are creating massive LLMs across the enterprise data, including the first party and the third party data, you cannot centralize it. You have to stop creating data silos, right? So open table formats is revolutionizing this space rapidly. How many of you are using open table formats today? Very few. But that's the key. So you got to start adopting open table formats. Icebergs is probably one of the best in that space. Observability we talked about. When you bring all of this together, data together, when you have to create that connected data ecosystem, data products and marketplace has got to be the key. How is it going to be consumed? What wisdom is required from there? Who needs that wisdom? When it is required is what defines how I need to render that data. Not a static ad hoc report using visualization tools. That has its role, but that role is diminishing. A lot of smart agents are getting built today in the pipeline. I gave one example around data quality where you can do self-healing of some of those aspects. In the classical data operations kind of a world, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, almost 1.5, 2.5 is now being done through smart agents. There are some of our clients who are talking about managing a workforce of digital agents and human workforce together. That's the amount of evolution which is happening. Obviously, if you take all of this together, what spits out is basically a smarter platform and not just a modern platform. But the one thing which is going to be very critical to enable all of this is what's on point 8. It is pushing the way IT and business teams have traditionally collaborated with each other. It's the governance role is becoming much more active rather than a passive governance where we used to set up governance meetings where half the people will show up, half will not show up, and make some decisions about what needs to be done on this entity versus this data element and so on and so forth. The governance has to be much more active. It has to be a 24/7 kind of a governance, which is not based on the traditional way it has been run in the past. How does all of this come to the bear? If you look at the previous slide had a lot of words in English, but if you look at it, how it, on a reference architecture, it really comes together is, and this is one representation of the reference architecture. Now, anything which you read on this slide is not going to be a new word for any of you guys. These are common definitions, these are common terminologies, these are common concepts. What is different is the innovation which has happened in technology is how you apply them. For example, everything today starts from the right. How are you going to consume it? Who's my consumer? What do they exactly need? I don't want to create a traditional data, call it marketplace, not marketplace, call it an analytical data mart, create a semantic model on it, and expose it to business and say, do your self-service. That is not self-service in today's world. That's what causes problems. That does not generate wisdom. That just generates tech debt, right? So you have to look at the right side, focus on the marketplace aspects. Looking at that, then you go left on the architecture and say, how am I going to build it? What are the anomalies in the data which are going to happen? What can I smartly fix? What I will still need a manual intervention? How the data contracts are going to play a bridge between left side and the right side of this architecture. And more importantly, while you're building the middle side, which is the data pipelining, which is the data ecosystem, I have to build it very consciously focusing on what is on the left side, which is the data trust. Data quality has to be part of every ETL job or ELT job. Anything which you expose out of it cannot be without catalog, cannot be without lineage, cannot be without a glossary. If I have to put an ML engine or an AI ML combination engine to generate wisdom out of it, the system needs to know how these things are interlinked. System needs to know what job ran today, what is the age of my data, is it latest data, who has access to it, and all of this has to be done at runtime. Okay, I think I did too much of talking. Shouldn't have been doing that much. Mike, let's go back to Cox. So you obviously have well-identified business challenges, right? We also have, and I know the horizons keep changing. You get to a certain point, something else, the new horizon shows up. We also have somewhat a North Star of where we want to go from a data ecosystem standpoint, right? How are you thinking about kind of giving shape to it? What's your strategy? How are you planning to address this and bring all of this together?
Yeah, so you'll see the term on here. Actually, go back one slide, right? So the heading for this is going from data-driven to decision-centric. And that's a little bit of some fancy words in there, but that's really kind of the overall goal of what we want to do. It's less about having data-drive decisions, which we've been doing for years, but more about how that becomes more the way we make broader decisions versus tactical data decisions. So on the next slide. So I think, Pankaj gave a great example of where the industry is going and a lot of things that have happened, and I forget the numbers. 1 in 6 companies is
data master.
Data master, and we're probably not there yet, and we certainly weren't there 2 or 3 years ago when we started down this journey. But we made a decision as a company for the reasons I said earlier on where Cox is in the market, Cox Communications, and where the market is, quite frankly, that we needed to make some different decisions. We needed to make some different investments in data. We needed to make some different investments in the way we ran our company and organized our company to go do that. And I'm not going to read all this slide, but focus on the goal over there on the right, which is how did we take our objectives, our priorities, our goals, our policies, and everything, and make them around data, right? And so you'll see the phrase access to real-time, secure, quality, governed. You could put some other adjectives in there to make that work, but it's really about having a single source of data, and that single source of data being used across the company, and the word is trust. Right? We want people to trust that data based on the latency of it, based on the quality of it, based on the security of it, and so forth. And some of that's driven externally, and some of that's driven internally. So we made a decision to launch into a journey 2.5 years ago to really kind of move ourselves into be one of the 1 in 6 companies that have mastered that. Again, still early in the journey. We have a long way to go, but we've made some good progress so far.
And the dimensions of the principles which I was talking about, you have them kind of segregated between, you have a 5-6 prong data strategy where you have mapped them, right?
Yeah, it's exactly right. And I think if you go to the next slide on this, so when we set about doing this, we decided to put together our data framework, our data strategy, and that's what you see on this diagram right here. And bear with me, I'm going to spend a few minutes on this slide on how we go through it. But up at the top, we use the term insight generation. And so just think of that as any way someone in our company is going to use information. Right? Historically, we've thought about reporting data, we've thought about operational data. Those are very important still, but increasingly we're using data to do analytical modeling, and we're hoping to move more aggressively into leveraging it for AI. So those are all the different reasons. I'm on the technology side, so in some ways, these are my internal customers. These are people who need the data in the format we're in, and we go service it to them. Stepping down to the bottom, I think the answer to your question is we came up with 5 pillars of how we were going to organize the work we were doing. Similar, I think, to your 8 principles, and you'll see a lot of alignment on there. Pankaj fortunately said data quality should shift left. We have it literally left on the slide, but that's just a coincidence. But I think if you think of these are the areas, and they're not just technology improvements. I love the technology, that's what I do, but our data transformation is really about moving the whole organization. So as an example, data quality, we have absolutely done a better job of building in tools to monitor how fast jobs go, monitor when records aren't there, putting thresholding in, and that's important. But what really makes data quality go is, I think, the shift left concept that Pankaj says, right? We need to have an organizational understanding, what is data quality? When is a zero okay? When is a record not supposed to be there? When do we go redo it? There's some definitional things that we as technologists have to work with the business to make sure we understand. And once we have an issue, do we have a process to go fix it, right? I spend a lot of my life with people calling me or emailing going, my data looks wrong. I'm like, what do we do? And by the way, they're usually right. My internal customers have been looking at data for years. They generally know when something is off. But we don't really have a great process, or we didn't at this time, to go figure out how to fix that. So all of these are about things like building the tools for data quality, but also building the processes as a company to identify the issues, have someone accountable for it, make those changes, and see them all the way through.
Okay.
I think those 5 boxes down at the left, I'm not going to read through each one of them. Data platform and architecture, we're going to spend a little bit more time on here in a few minutes. Sure. The others are really around master data management is the equivalent, I think, of what you had as data products on your slide. Data governance and privacy, obviously a big part of what we need to do here. And metadata management is really tracking it, information management tools, cataloging, and so forth. I do, though, operating model is in the middle of this slide, and that's intentional, and it's probably the most important piece on this, right? So again, you kind of think of it as a little bit the business users up at the top, the technology and the business internal groups that are in charge of data down at the bottom, but it's all about, we've got to build an operating model that works across the company. And that's a lot of what all these things do, is a lot of the work we have in front of us. The 2 words at the end, data culture, this is my favorite part on this slide. Again, we've made some strides in this, but in order to make this work, the whole company has to think of data differently. Right? They
Absolutely.
have to think of data as a product, is a word you used.
Yep.
They have to think of, we use the term enterprise data. So everybody in the company doesn't have their data, they have enterprise data that they use, right? And so they have an accountability for that. As a business owner, we have accountability for it as a technologist to make sure we leverage that. We make that data trustworthy. We're accountable, stewarding that data all the way through. And that's a culture thing. People have to think a little bit differently about data. I always say to them, you don't have a copy of data. You don't need a copy of data. You need access to data. And that's what we need to do as a business team and a technology team, is to make it accessible. But we need their help to get on board with that. And it's a culture change, and it is, it's not easy.
It's not easy. It's not easy. And you got to make it discoverable as well, easily discoverable too. So.
Trust and accessibility are kind of the 2 words we use over and over again. And really all those phrases about security and real time and all that, that's really about trust. Yeah. And accessibility is about, once we have it there, people have to be able to get to it and know where it is. Exactly right.
That was the left side tower, which we had the data trust on the reference architecture. So absolutely. Now, great strategy, right? And I know Cox team, you and the rest of the data and analytics team, they have been on this journey for some time. A lot more work to do, but they have been on this journey. Share a little bit about how it has come to life, right? You have an ecosystem, you call it enterprise data ecosystem, which exists today. Yep. And I'm hearing that there's an evolution of that. There's some 2.0 coming in some form or fashion. So give us a little bit of a sneak peek into what has been achieved so far. What is enterprise data ecosystem?
Sure, and if you want to go to the next slide. So, enterprise data ecosystem is the term we use to describe what we have been building to support our data strategy, right? Okay. And this is a logical architecture. We're not really getting into the details of the technology in this particular case, but you can think about, the EDE, we call it the enterprise data ecosystem, is a physical platform. One of the initial decisions we made when we started on this journey was that we needed to move from a lot of the legacy work we had. We needed to re-platform stuff. Made a decision to go with hyperscalers, particularly AWS, which is part of why we're here today, is that has been a good decision for us and been successful. And our SI partner, which in this case is Capgemini, has been working with us on this journey to go build this out. But in simple terms, while it's not a physical architecture, you can kind of see the major steps. It's really about how do we make the data, we call it less hops, right? In our old world, most data didn't go from A to B. It went from A to B to C to D to E, all over the place. And so this is really about how do we reduce it from source systems on the left, ingest it into the ecosystem. From there, maybe make one hop internally from a raw data source to a domain model, and then make it available for user groups. One of the examples I mentioned on the challenges was our network, right? And that is the heart of our company, is that network, and that network needs to work. It needs to work for everybody working at their house, working from home, or taking a school test or whatever they're doing, and it needs to work for companies like the stadium, right? It's got to work for both. And so we had a system where we were able to we call it polling, right? So we basically poll all the devices in our network, and there's millions of them across all that network. and load that through. And we had an ecosystem that captured that on an overnight basis, ran it through, did a bunch of reporting, and came up with some reports. And then there was a whole nother set of data where we ran that through, and we created some operational systems and loaded it into ticketing platforms. And so we really had 3 or 4 different ways we were doing it. Created a situation where they were all different, mostly because it was a different point in time and a different use case, and it just made things very cumbersome, and it didn't get to the vision I had of trustworthy, right? And it didn't get to the vision of useful. So what this did, a good example is we built the polling platform. That data is ingested in there. We have one single source for all that polling data, which in this case comes in every 15 minutes for some devices, a little less often for other devices. And we run it through the journal store. There's a team that's accountable for the definition of what polling data is. We call it network topology. And then the key thing is here, if you look at boxes 3, 4, and 5, they're all accessing the same piece of information. Right, so I don't have the problem of the team looking at a report is different than the team looking at the operational system, and increasingly able to use that for operational purposes. So that's an example of how we use that.
I think you wanted.
Yeah, actually, can you go back one more thing? You know, I think one. EDE has been built, and we've done a pretty good job of, we call it hydrating, you know, bringing the data in and making it available, and we're continuing to use that over and over for internal customers. I mentioned accessibility up front as one of our goals, and I think if there's anything I would say I would do differently, we should have emphasized accessibility of the data even more than we did up front. Right, so we would build it for one internal customer, make it available for them, but really looking into building a marketplace, making data discoverable. Once I get that raw data in for one internal customer, how do I make it available for everybody else? And so we are pivoting to that. We're spending more internal cycles on that solution and making it, but we focus a lot on getting the data in and a little bit less on making it, I'll say, discoverable, making it self-serve for internal customers. And that's one thing I would probably pivot a little differently.
That's the one which we need to focus on.
So there's a couple slides. I'm going to step through these pretty quickly. Again, this is an architecture slide, and I'm not going to get into the architecture. I will say, you know, the slide before, part of why we left it logical and not physical is, well, the individual components within AWS and the individual components that the partners have is important, and my team and I and with our partners spend a lot of time making sure we're using the right ones. But at the end of the day, the strategy isn't about that technology, right? Because that technology is changing. You guys have all spent 4 days learning all the new stuff that's out there by AWS and by all the partners, and that's why we picked it, is so we have advantage to take advantage of that. But it's less about the exact technology and how we do it piece by piece within the ecosystem. It's more about moving it through in some of the principles we do. So glad to answer any questions about this after the meeting if someone has it, but I wasn't going to drill into that. Data products. So Pankaj mentioned data products as one of the principles that you had to do. We have laid out all of our data, and our target is that every piece of information at Cox Communications would be allocated to one of what do we call domains. There's, I think, 42 on this list. It moves around a little bit and gets a little bigger and gets a little smaller depending how we're defining data. But from a governance and accountability perspective, our attempt is to organize all the information into one of these domains. And each domain has a business owner, has a technology team that loads that data, which is mostly my organization, but it's really more about governing that, stewarding it, making it available and discoverable, and this is a key part of what we're working on now as well as rolling that out to the business. Okay. Polling on there, by the way, I mentioned earlier was number 17, so if anybody's watching that closely. And then data quality, observability, lineage, et cetera. A lot of what we're doing on that ecosystem is not just about the moving the data from A to B to C, it's watching it, right? What are the rules? How do we know when something breaks? How do internal customers know when something breaks? I don't want them to come to me. I want them to be able to go see on the dashboard what job got loaded and what didn't. So a lot of what we're building is not so much the moving the data from A to B, but how we keep an eye on it, how we track it, how we observe it, and how we monitor it, and that's a lot of what's in the EDE as well.
And this is visible to the business teams.
It is, and that's another area we're continuing to broaden that because it's. But yes, that's the goal. My goal is that nobody sends me an email asking what happened. They go to the dashboard and they can see what happened. Right?
Don't come to me.
Still have a ways to go, but that's the eventual goal is that they should be able to see a trend. And our team is focused less on answering questions and more on fixing things that break, which they will. And the business customers are spending less time tracking us down and more time, looking on dashboards to go do it. So that's the goal. That's the end goal.
So Mike, I mean, this is great. So we started this conversation with whatever we do on the data and analytics side, it has to be done for a purpose. And the purpose is business, right? Amongst all the work which has been delivered so far, I know firsthand there are quite a few success stories over there. If you have to pick up one, which one would you pick?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that in two parts. So I mentioned earlier some of the stuff we did with polling. I'm not going to drill into that. I think that has been a big success story, and we're continuing to see our analytics teams take that information and move to a lot more of a proactive type of model. So that's been one area. The one I think I would highlight, though, is what we've really spent on the last 6 months or so doing, which is for our what we call Cox Business, which is our B2B division that services things like this hotel and the stadium, as well as a lot of small businesses throughout the country. Is we really worked with them on building out or hydrating the EDE for the data they needed, right? So you can see the wheel on here. This is all the information. Again, very similar to most companies. They have CRM systems and billing systems and marketing systems and so forth, sales. It's a little complicated if you've worked with business customers. The hierarchies are very complicated. They have a bunch of locations. They have a bunch of contacts that are a part of that, and so it's really complicated. And we had a challenge that each system that we had built over years looked at that a little bit differently, defined it a little bit differently, and so over time that kind of got a life of its own. So we really sat down with that team and worked on how do we take the data from those systems that is very different from a hierarchical perspective, load it into the domains. So again, one of those 42 domains was Cox Business. It actually overlapped a couple of them, and loaded it back in there. And we have, over the last 6 months, loaded most of that data in to the point that they're starting to use it. The reason I highlight that is, while it's interesting from a technology perspective, it accomplished a lot of what we wanted to do when I talked about culture, right? We got that team on board. They took accountability for defining the domain. They took accountability and are working with us on the data quality. They're taking accountability on how we're going to change the definition of the domain, and governance that you mentioned is a part of it. And we're starting to see value from that. Their sales numbers are, they're able to run more efficiently on the sales side because they've just got one view of the data. Mm-hmm. We're able to map that across our different systems, both sales and marketing and so forth, and so seeing some benefits of that.
Okay. I mean, just to kind of summarize, and I know we're getting towards the top of the hour, we looked at the reference architecture at the beginning of this discussion. Mike talked about and he walked us through some of the work which has been done on the ground, some of the successes which have been enabled. Now, how it looks on that reference architecture is something like this. It is, I would say, a tip of an iceberg. Would you agree? Right? So what you see on this architecture is predominantly the green areas is what there is good amount of foundational work done. It has already started delivering some of the successes which Mike talked about, and you're talking about, for example, polling data with a very low latency input coming in, and again, you're talking about from hundreds and thousands of devices all over the country. So volume, velocity, the complexity of that, and you're already seeing business value getting derived out of it. As part of the evolution, it's now where, and I know it's not finally firmed up, but we're still kind of working through how the North Star is going to define. This is the kind of capabilities which we now need to start building upon. I mean, you have a foundation in place, but then on that foundation, how do you now start bringing in that wisdom element into this ecosystem? We created a modern ecosystem, but now we have to take it to that the smart modern ecosystem kind of thing. So that being said, I think, as I said, I mean, I know we kind of kept it light, we kept it a little short, just being cognizant of the fact that it's 4 long days over here in Vegas. So we're going to stop over here. If you have any questions, Mike and I are going to be around here for some time.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.